The sun, heavy in the mid-afternoon sky, cast its golden rays over the roads that wound through the villages near the Sea of Galilee. As Jesus walked the dusty path, his sandals brushing against the earth with each step, he seemed to glide through the world, a figure of calm amidst the hustle and bustle of the towns he passed through. His appearance was humble, clad in simple robes, his face framed by dark hair that had been tousled by the wind, but his presence carried a quiet authority that captivated all who crossed his path. As he approached a small village nestled on the edge of the Galilean hills, the sounds of daily life greeted him. Children's laughter, the rhythmic hum of villagers working in their fields, and the distant call of merchants selling their wares. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and the salty breeze from the nearby sea. But as Jesus made his way through the village, he noticed a solitary figure sitting by the side of the road, his head lowered and his body slumped against the stone wall of a crumbling building. The beggar, his clothes tattered and worn, was an old man, his face etched with lines of hardship. But it was his eyes, or rather the lack of them, that caught Jesus' attention. The man was blind, his gaze vacant, and though he sat alone, there was an aura of strength in him, a will that had endured despite the affliction he faced. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching occasionally as if he were reaching for something, though his vision was absent. For years, the beggar had been forced to sit in the same spot, begging for coins, hoping for a fleeting moment of grace from those passing by. As Jesus continued his walk, his disciples, who were following closely behind, noticed the beggar as well, their eyes briefly flickering toward him. They exchanged glances, and some of them seemed uneasy at the sight of the blind man. They knew that Jesus had performed miracles before, but they weren't sure how he would respond this time. They had learned by now that every interaction with Jesus had the potential to shift the course of their lives. But this man, the beggar, seemed so far removed from the world they knew. His blindness, his poverty, his isolation, it all seemed like too much to overcome. It was then that the beggar heard Jesus' footsteps. At first they were faint, but they grew louder as the figure of the man drew nearer. The beggar's head lifted slightly, and though he could not see, he seemed to sense the presence of someone different. His heart began to race. There was something about this man, a peace, a strength, that set him apart from the others. Without hesitation, the beggar called out, his voice rough but filled with hope, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The crowd, which had gathered around Jesus, seemed to freeze for a moment. Some gasped, others whispered, but Jesus did not hesitate. His eyes, full of compassion, sought the beggar in the distance. He made his way toward the man, his feet sure, his pace unhurried. The people who surrounded Jesus stepped aside, allowing him space to approach the beggar. When Jesus reached the beggar, he stood in front of him, his presence calm and assuring. There was no judgment in his eyes, no condemnation for the man's poverty or his blindness. Jesus knelt before him, his robes brushing against the ground, and placed his hands gently on the man's shoulders. For a moment there was silence. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked, his voice soft but clear. The beggar, though his eyes were clouded, felt a stirring in his heart. Could it be? Could this man truly help him? He had heard rumors of this healer, this teacher who could perform miracles, but he had never dared to believe that he might be worthy of such a gift. "Lord, the beggar said, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and faith, "that I may see." There was a long pause. The beggar's breath hitched in his chest as he awaited an answer. He had asked for a simple thing, a return to sight, but for someone who had lived in darkness for so long, it seemed impossible. The people gathered around the scene held their breath. What would Jesus do? Would he grant the beggar's request? Then Jesus smiled, a small, knowing smile, and he touched the beggar's eyes. It was a gentle touch, but there was a power in it, a divine energy that seemed to ripple through the air. The beggar's heart raced as he felt warmth spreading from Jesus' fingertips, coursing through his body. He had never felt anything like it before, like a light being ignited within him. "Open your eyes," Jesus said softly, and the beggar felt the warmth intensify. Slowly, cautiously, the beggar opened his eyes. At first, everything was a blur. shadows and colors blending together. But then, like the fog lifting after a storm, the world around him began to sharpen into focus. He blinked, disbelieving, and then, there they were, the familiar shapes of the world The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the hills surrounding the village. It was the time of day when the air seemed to soften, when the bright light of the day mellowed into a quiet, golden hue. Jesus, having walked many miles, was now making his way along a narrow path that cut through a lush valley. The valley was home to green pastures that stretched out beneath the high, jagged peaks of distant mountains. It was the kind of place where peace seemed to dwell, where the gentle bleating of sheep and the soft hum of the wind through the trees made it feel like the world was still. His disciples walked beside him, their footsteps echoing on the earth. But as they moved through the valley, they began to notice a figure in the distance. At first, it was just a small dot among the rocky terrain, but as they came closer, it became clear that it was a man. He was standing by the side of the path, his posture tense, his eyes searching the landscape as if looking for something or someone. The man was a shepherd, his dark hair falling in waves around his face, and his clothes were simple but worn, as though he had spent many days walking through the wilderness, his hands calloused from years of guiding his flock. Jesus and his disciples approached the man, who turned to greet them. His face was drawn with worry, and his eyes spoke of a deep concern that had not yet been resolved. "Master," the shepherd said, bowing his head respectfully as Jesus came closer, "I seek your help." Jesus stopped and regarded the shepherd, his face calm but inquisitive. "What troubles you, my friend?" The shepherd hesitated for a moment, glancing out at the hills before him. "I have lost one of my sheep," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I have searched these hills high and low, but the lamb is nowhere to be found. I fear for its safety. The wild beasts roam these mountains and the night falls quickly. I cannot leave it out there." Jesus looked at the shepherd with compassion, understanding the pain in his words. He knew that for a shepherd, a single lost sheep was not merely a minor inconvenience. It was a deep sorrow, one that spoke to the shepherd's responsibility and love for the flock he tended. A shepherd was not just a caretaker for the animals. He was a protector, a guide, and a friend to each sheep under his care. To lose one was not just a loss of a creature. It was a loss of trust, a break in the bond that tied the shepherd to his flock. "I will help you," Jesus said with a gentle smile. "Show me where the lamb was last seen." The shepherd nodded, his face filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. He turned and led Jesus and his disciples further up the valley, into the rougher terrain where the hills began to rise sharply. As they climbed, the air grew colder and the path became narrower, winding through rocky outcrops and thickets of brush. The shepherd moved quickly, his feet sure on the uneven ground. But there was a weariness to his movements, as if he had already walked this path many times in search of the lost sheep. They walked for what seemed like hours, the sun dipping lower in the sky, the shadows of the hills lengthening. The shepherd spoke little, but his eyes were constantly scanning the landscape, looking for any sign of the missing lamb. Every now and then, he would call out, his voice echoing off the cliffs, hoping for an answer, but there was only silence. At last, they reached the top of a high hill, from which the entire valley below could be seen in its fullness. The shepherd stood still, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. He looked out at the expanse of land before him, rolling fields, patches of forest, and distant cliffs, but there was no sign of the lost lamb. His heart sank. The sun was now low on the horizon, casting an orange glow across the valley, and he knew that soon it would be too dark to search. The wild beasts that roamed the hills would soon emerge, and the lamb, vulnerable and alone, would not survive the night. Jesus stood beside him, his eyes scanning the landscape as well. There was no panic in his demeanor, no rush to solve the problem. Instead, he simply observed, taking in the scene with quiet wisdom. Then, without warning, Jesus started walking toward the edge of the hill. The shepherd turned, confused. "Master, where are you going? The lamb is not here." Jesus did not answer immediately, but continued walking, his footsteps sure and steady. The shepherd hesitated for a moment, then followed, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He had spent hours searching for the lamb. What could Jesus possibly know that he did not? They walked together for a time, the quiet only broken by the sounds of their feet crunching on the dry earth. The sun was now just a sliver on the horizon, and the shadows of the valley stretched long and dark. As they reached a narrow pass between two large rocks, they heard a faint bleating in the distance. The road that stretched out before Jesus was long and winding, carrying him through countless villages and towns that lay along the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Each day brought new faces, new stories, and new opportunities for healing, teaching, and connecting with those who longed for the message he brought. And yet, as he walked, Jesus knew that there were still many who had yet to hear the word, many who were still in darkness, searching for something, anything, that could give meaning to their lives. On this particular day, as he entered a village perched on the edge of a gently sloping hill, the air was heavy with expectancy. The crowds had already gathered in anticipation of his arrival, their murmurs rising like a wave as word spread that Jesus had come to town. Some had traveled for miles, some from distant lands, and all had one thing in common: the hunger in their hearts. As Jesus stepped into the center of the village, he paused to take in the scene before him. There were children running to and fro, their laughter ringing through the streets. Women bustled with activity, preparing food, gathering water, and going about their daily tasks. Men stood in small groups discussing the weather, their work, and the news from neighboring villages. But despite the everyday activities, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something momentous was about to take place. Jesus stood for a moment, his eyes sweeping across the gathering crowd. He saw their faces, their expressions filled with hope, with longing, and with a kind of quiet desperation. Some of them had come seeking healing, others to hear his teachings, and still others to be in the presence of the one who had captured their imaginations and hearts. But all of them shared one thing in common. They were hungry, not just for food, but for something deeper, something that could fill the emptiness within them. Turning to his disciples, Jesus spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of a truth he had known all along. "The people are hungry," he said, "not just for food, but for the word of God. We must feed them." The disciples exchanged glances, unsure of how they could meet such a need. The village was small, its resources limited, and they knew that they could not possibly feed the thousands who had gathered. There were no markets with abundant supplies of food, no feast awaiting them. How could they possibly satisfy such a great hunger? But Jesus knew that this was not just about physical food. It was about the deeper hunger within each person, the longing for something that could not be filled by bread alone. He knew that by meeting this need, he would not only heal their bodies, but he would also heal their spirits, drawing them closer to the love of God. A young disciple, Andrew, stepped forward hesitantly. "Master," he said, his voice uncertain, "we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. How can that possibly be enough for so many?" Jesus turned to him with a calm smile. "Bring them to me," he said. Andrew, still unsure, went to a nearby boy who had been sitting near the edge of the crowd, clutching a small basket. The boy had heard the conversation and, seeing the disciples, approached with a quiet but determined look on his face. In his basket were the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, his own humble lunch, which he had brought for the long day ahead. With a nod of understanding, Andrew took the basket from the boy's hands and brought it to Jesus. The crowd watched in silence, unsure of what was about to happen. Jesus took the basket from Andrew, looking at the loaves of bread and the fish with a calm, steady gaze. He lifted his eyes to the heavens, his hands held out in prayer. And in that moment, everything seemed to pause. The wind stopped blowing, the chatter of the crowd ceased, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. "Father," Jesus said, his voice low but clear, "we give thanks for this food. Blessed, and may it be enough to feed all who hunger." Then with a simple but profound gesture, Jesus began to break the bread. As he tore the loaves into pieces, he handed them to his disciples, instructing them to distribute the food to the people. To everyone's amazement, the loaves did not diminish. They multiplied, growing larger with every break, with every distribution. The fish, too, were divided and passed around, growing more abundant as the disciples carried them to the crowds. The people sat in stunned silence at first, unsure of what was happening. But as the food reached them, their skepticism turned to awe. They began to eat, their hunger satisfied with each bite, their eyes widening with amazement at the miracle unfolding before them. As the last of the loaves and fish were passed out, Jesus looked out over the crowd, his heart full of compassion for the people who had gathered. He saw the joy in their faces as they ate, the satisfaction of their physical hunger now matched. The sun was high in the sky, casting its brilliant rays over the land as Jesus and his disciples traveled from village to village. The road was long and winding, but it was the path that Jesus walked, and each step he took was filled with purpose. He moved with a quiet grace, his robes swaying gently with every step, his eyes scanning the crowds that gathered around him wherever he went. The people came from all directions, some to hear his teachings, others seeking healing or answers to the questions that weighed heavily on their hearts. But there was one thing they all shared. They all came because they believed that in Jesus they would find the answers they sought. On this particular day, the crowd was especially large. Word had spread quickly that Jesus was passing through a bustling town near the foot of a great mountain. The people gathered in the town square, filling the narrow streets, spilling out into the open fields that surrounded the village. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something incredible was about to happen. Jesus walked through the streets, his disciples trailing behind him, trying to keep up with the throngs of people who surrounded them. The crowd pressed in on all sides, eager to catch a glimpse of the one who had been healing the sick, casting out demons, and performing miracles that defied explanation. The buzz of voices was deafening, but Jesus remained calm, his face serene as he moved through the masses, his eyes filled with compassion for those who reached out to him. As they approached the center of the town, a commotion arose at the edge of the crowd. People parted to make way for a group of individuals carrying a stretcher. At first, Jesus could not see the figure lying on the stretcher, but as the group drew closer, he saw a young child, no older than 10 years old, lying motionless, her face pale, her body limp. The child's mother walked beside the stretcher, her face marked by lines of sorrow and worry. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled as they gripped the sides of the stretcher. She looked up at Jesus with a mixture of hope and desperation, as if she knew that he was the only one who could help her daughter. "Master," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper, "please, my daughter is gravely ill. She has been burning with fever for days and no one can help her. Please have mercy." Jesus turned to the woman, his heart moved by the pain in her voice. He stepped closer to the stretcher, his eyes scanning the child's pale face. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with great effort. She seemed to be on the brink of death, and yet Jesus knew that this moment was not one of despair. It was a moment of faith, a moment when the power of God would be made manifest. "Do not be afraid," Jesus said gently to the woman, his voice full of warmth. "Your faith has brought you here. Your daughter will be healed." The crowd fell silent, and the disciples exchanged looks of surprise. They had witnessed many healings before, but this was different. This child was so weak, so close to death, that it seemed impossible for anything or anyone to save her. And yet here was Jesus, standing before her, declaring that she would be healed. Jesus knelt beside the stretcher, his hands reaching out to touch the child's forehead. He felt the heat radiating from her skin, the fever that burned through her body. It was clear that her condition was dire, but Jesus' touch was calm, steady, and full of love. He spoke softly, but with authority. "Little one, arise." For a moment, there was silence, an almost sacred stillness in the air. And then, to the amazement of the crowd, the child's chest rose in a deep breath, and her eyes fluttered open. Her gaze was confused at first, as though she had just awakened from a deep sleep. But then she saw the face of Jesus, and her expression softened. She looked up at him, her eyes full of wonder and gratitude. The crowd gasped in astonishment as the child's fever broke. Her once pale face flushed with color, and the strength returned to her body. She sat up slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the stretcher as she took in her surroundings. The fever that had racked her body for days was gone, replaced by a new vitality, a new life that radiated from her. The woman, overcome with emotion, knelt beside her daughter, her tears of joy streaming down her face. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for saving her." Jesus smiled, his gaze tender. "Your faith has healed her," he said. "Go in peace, and may you both be blessed." The crowd that had gathered around them erupted in praise, their voices rising in wonder and amazement at the miracle they had just witnessed. Some of them were speechless, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just seen. Others praised God, recognizing that they had just witnessed the power of the divine in action. The morning light had barely touched the hills surrounding the town when Jesus arrived at the village on the edge of the desert. His sandals kicked up the fine dust of the road as he walked, his cloak gently flowing with every step. It was early, and the air still carried the crispness of the night, but there was already a stirring in the town as word of his arrival spread quickly. People were already gathering in small groups, whispering about the healer who had come to their village, the man who had given sight to the blind, made the lame walk, and cast out demons. Everywhere he went, his fame spread, and this quiet, dusty town was no exception. Jesus had been traveling for days, healing the sick, teaching the crowds, and performing miracles. His purpose was clear: to bring hope, healing, and salvation to a world broken by sin and suffering. Yet as much as the crowds were eager to see him, it was not the large gatherings or the public displays of power that truly mattered to Jesus. He had come not for the praise of men, but for the lost and the hurting, the outcasts and the forgotten. And it was in the quiet moments, in the one-on-one encounters, that his true mission was revealed. As he entered the village, Jesus was greeted by a small group of followers and curious onlookers. But amidst the crowd, one figure stood apart, isolated, his appearance different from the others. It was a man, disheveled and disfigured, wearing the tattered remnants of clothing. His hair was matted, and his face was marked with deep lines, some from age and others from suffering. He had the appearance of someone who had been through much, someone who had borne a heavy burden for a long time. What set him apart, however, was not just his appearance, but his condition. He had leprosy. In Jesus' time, leprosy was one of the most feared diseases. It was highly contagious and disfiguring, causing the skin to break down and the body to rot. Those who had leprosy were cast out from society, forced to live alone in colonies, away from their families and communities. They were considered unclean, and no one would dare approach them. It was as if they were invisible, condemned to a life of isolation and suffering. This man, though, did not stay in the shadows. He did not shrink away from the crowd. Instead, he walked forward, his eyes filled with a strange mix of desperation and hope. He knew that it was against the law to approach someone who was not afflicted with the disease, but he also knew that Jesus was no ordinary man. He had heard the stories, and something deep inside him told him that if anyone could heal him, it was this man, this Jesus. As the man approached Jesus, the crowd parted nervously, unsure of what would happen next. It was a moment of tension, a moment when fear and faith collided. But Jesus did not flinch. He did not step back. He did not call for the man to stay away. Instead, he looked directly at him, his gaze steady and filled with compassion. The leper fell to his knees before Jesus, his hands shaking as he begged, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what Jesus would do. To touch a leper was considered unthinkable. To approach someone with such a contagious and horrific disease could lead to ritual impurity, and yet Jesus did not hesitate. "I am willing," Jesus said, his voice gentle yet firm. "Be clean." And then, in a movement that shocked everyone around him, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. He did the unthinkable. He touched the leper. At that moment, a miracle occurred. The man's skin, which had been covered in sores and disfigured by the disease, began to heal. The leprosy that had ravaged his body vanished as though it had never been. The man's face, once gaunt and twisted by pain, began to soften, his skin becoming smooth and whole. The crowd gasped, and whispers of amazement rippled through the air. In an instant, the man was no longer a leper. He was whole. The leper looked at Jesus with tears in his eyes, his voice breaking with gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you." Jesus smiled at the man, and in that smile was the fullness of divine love. "Go," he said softly. "Show yourself to the priests and offered the gift that Moses commanded, as a testimony to them. The man, still in disbelief, nodded. He stood, his body shaking not from illness, but from the overwhelming sense of grace he had just experienced. As he turned to leave, he took one last look at Jesus, his heart full of awe and gratitude. He had come to Jesus with nothing but a desperate plea, and now he was leaving healed, restored, and free. The crowd that had watched the entire scene unfold stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed a miracle, something that defied all logic and reason. It was a moment that would change their lives forever, a moment when they saw the power of God in the flesh. But for Jesus,